Welcome to this daily PBJ devotional. Read 1 Kings 7 and Ezekiel 37 today. This devotional is about 1 Kings 7:1. Solomon, however, took 13 years to complete the construction of his entire palace. He built the house of the forest of Lebanon 100 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high, with 4 rows of cedar pillars supporting the cedar beams. The house was roofed with cedar above the beams that rested on the pillars, 45 beams, 15 per row. There were 3 rows of high windows, facing one another in 3 tiers. All the doorways had rectangular frames, with the openings facing one another in 3 tiers. Solomon made his colonnade 50 cubits long and 30 cubits wide, with a portico in front of it and a canopy with pillars in front of the portico. In addition, he built a hall for the throne, the Hall of Justice, where he was to judge. It was paneled with cedar from floor to ceiling. And the palace where Solomon would live, set further back, was of similar construction. He had made a palace like this hall for Pharaoh's daughter, whom he had married. All these buildings were constructed with costly stones, cut to size and trimmed with saws inside and out, from the foundation to the eaves, and from the outside to the great courtyard. The foundations were laid with large, costly stones, some 10 cubits long and some 8 cubits long. Above these were high-grade stones, cut to size, and cedar beams. The great courtyard was surrounded by 3 rows of dressed stone and a row of trimmed cedar beams, as were the inner courtyard and portico of the house of the Lord. Now King Solomon sent to bring Huram from Tyre. He was the son of a widow from the tribe of Naphtali, and his father was a man of Tyre, a craftsman in bronze. Huram had great skill, understanding, and knowledge for every kind of bronze work. So he came to King Solomon and carried out all his work. He cast 2 pillars of bronze, each 18 cubits high and 12 cubits in circumference. He also made 2 capitals of cast bronze to set on top of the pillars, each capital 5 cubits high. For the capitals on top of the pillars, he made a network of lattice with wreaths of chainwork, 7 for each capital. Likewise, he made the pillars with 2 rows of pomegranates around each grating to cover each capital atop the pillars. And the capitals atop the pillars in the portico were shaped like lilies, 4 cubits high. On the capitals of both pillars, just above the rounded projection near the network, were the 200 pomegranates in rows encircling each capital. Thus he set up the pillars at the portico of the temple. The pillar to the south he named Jashin, and the pillar to the north he named Boaz, and the tops of the pillars were shaped like lilies, so the work of the pillars was completed. He also made the sea of cast metal. It was circular in shape, measuring 10 cubits from rim to rim, 5 cubits in height, and 30 cubits in circumference. Below the rim, ornamental buds encircled it, 10 per cubit all the way around the sea, cast in 2 rows as part of the sea. The sea stood on 12 oxen, 3 facing north, 3 facing west, 3 facing south, and 3 facing east. The sea rested on them, with all their hind quarters toward the center. It was a handbreadth thick, and its rim was fashioned like the brim of a cup, like a lily blossom. It could hold 2,000 baths. In addition, he made 10 movable stands of bronze, each 4 cubits long, 4 cubits wide, and 3 cubits high. This was the design of the stands. They had side panels attached to uprights, and on the panels between the uprights were lions, oxen, and cherubim. On the uprights was a pedestal above, and below the lions and oxen were wreaths of beveled work. Each stand had 4 bronze wheels, with bronze axles, and a basin resting on 4 supports, with wreaths at each side. The opening to each stand inside the crown at the top was 1 cubit deep, with a round opening like the design of a pedestal, a cubit and a half wide, and around its opening were engravings, but the panels of the stands were square, not round. There were 4 wheels under the panels, and the axles of the wheels were attached to the stand. Each wheel was a cubit and a half in diameter. The wheels were made like chariot wheels. Their axles, rims, spokes, and hubs were all of cast metal. Each stand had 4 handles, one for each corner, projecting from the stand. At the top of each stand was a circular band half a cubit high. The supports and panels were cast as a unit with the top of the stand. He engraved cherubim, lions, and palm trees on the surfaces of the supports and panels, wherever each had space, with wreaths all around. In this way, he made the 10 stands, each with the same casting, dimensions, and shape. He also made 10 basins, each holding 40 baths and measuring 4 cubits across, 1 basin for each of the 10 stands. He set 5 stands on the south side of the temple and 5 on the north, and he put the sea on the south side at the southeast corner of the temple. Additionally, Huram made the pots, shovels, and sprinkling bowls. So Huram finished all the work that he had undertaken for King Solomon in the house of the Lord. The 2 pillars, the 2 bowl-shaped capitals atop the pillars, the 2 sets of network covering both bowls of the capitals atop the pillars, the 400 pomegranates for the 2 sets of network, 2 rows of pomegranates for each network covering both the bowl-shaped capitals atop the pillars, the 10 stands, the 10 basins on the stands, the sea, the 12 oxen underneath the sea, and the pots, shovels, and sprinkling bowls. All the articles that Huram made for King Solomon in the house of the Lord were made of burnished bronze. The king had them cast in clay molds in the plain of the Jordan between Succoth and Zarethan. Solomon left all these articles unweighed because there were so many. The weight of the bronze could not be determined. Solomon also made all the furnishings for the house of the Lord, the golden altar, the golden table on which was placed the bread of the presence, the lampstands of pure gold in front of the inner sanctuary, 5 on the right side and 5 on the left, the gold flowers, lamps, and tongs, the pure basins, wick trimmers, sprinkling bowls, ladles, and censers, and the gold hinges for the doors of the inner temple, that is, the most holy place, as well as for the doors of the main hall of the temple. So all the work that King Solomon had performed for the house of the Lord was completed. Then Solomon brought in the items his father David had dedicated, the silver, the gold, and the furnishings, and he placed them in the treasuries of the house of the Lord. This is God's word. The last verse of 1 Kings 6, which we read yesterday, told us that Solomon spent 7 years building the temple of the Lord. The first verse here in chapter 7 says, it took Solomon 13 years, however, to complete the construction of his palace. The chapter and verse divisions in the Bible are not inspired and were made long after both the Old and New Testaments were complete. Whoever made them decided to end chapter 6 with the statement that the temple took 7 years. The same person decided, obviously, to start chapter 7 with the contrasting statement that Solomon's palace took 13 years to build. That decision, where to end chapter 6 and start chapter 7, was unfortunate, because the original author meant for those 2 statements to stand back to back as a contrast. He wanted us to know that Solomon spent much more time on his own home than he did on the Lord's house. I guess Solomon's house could have been beset by construction delays, but that's probably not why his house took so much longer to build. If we compare the dimensions that are given in chapters 6 and 7, in other words, between the temple and Solomon's palace, we will see that Solomon's house was much larger than the temple. Notice, 1 Kings 6:2 says that the temple was 60 cubits by 20 cubits by 30 cubits. In contrast, 1 Kings 7:2 says that the palace was 100 cubits by 50 cubits by 30 cubits. So 60 to 100, 20 to 50, 30, and 30. So the two buildings were the same height, but Solomon's house was much bigger, much longer and wider than the temple he built for worshiping the Lord. Now, Solomon's house wasn't just a residence. It was a government building where he also lived. We can see that in verse 7, where we read about the throne hall, the hall of justice, where he was to judge. And then verse 8's statement, the palace in which he was to live, set farther back, was similar in design. But the human author of 1 Kings wanted us to see that Solomon's palace was much larger and took much longer to build than the temple of the Lord did. The point is that Solomon did an incredible job building a house for the Lord, but he spent even more money building a house for himself. In other words, he was self-centered, materialistic, and showed poor priorities in the contrast between these two buildings. Do our lives reflect the same struggle with priorities and self-centeredness? Do we give our best energy to our career and our hobbies, and then just give the leftovers to serving the Lord? Do we spend money lavishly on ourselves while being stingy when it comes to financially supporting the Lord's work? Think about these things in terms of Solomon and what is said about how he spent money. And I'll see you next time. May God bless you. Hope you have a great day today.